The channel has now reached more than 600,000 subscribers, and we're so thankful that so many people continue to support what we do here and are just as fascinated as we are by prehistoric life. To celebrate this amazing milestone, we're going to take a look at what the Earth was like 600,000 years ago, back during a time known as the Pleistocene epoch. I'll be covering what animals were living back then, featuring a species known from every continent except Antarctica. Then Emilia is going to talk to you about what the climate and geography was like, before Doug covers the human species that were alive and what we know about their evolution and lifestyles at this time. So let's travel back in time to Earth 600,000 years ago. If you were to start off your time traveling adventure in North America, then one animal you'd better watch out for would be the ferocious Arctodus, the short-faced bears. There are two species of these bears that lived in prehistoric America, the smaller Arctodus pristinus and the giant short-faced bear Arctodus simus. Both of these species were alive around 600,000 years ago, and despite looking rather cuddly, you probably wouldn't want to get too close to those murder mittens. Arctodus simus was a massive animal, with estimated body weights of up to 957 kilograms, or just over 1 US ton. When on its hind legs, it could have stood up to 3.4 meters, or just over 11 feet tall. For reference, the biggest confirmed modern polar bears can get to about 800 kilograms in weight, and just over 10 feet when standing. So Arctodus simus was likely the largest terrestrial mammalian carnivore that's ever inhabited North America. Despite being called short-faced bears, the snouts of Arctodus were not especially shortened compared to other bear species, although they were rather broad. They also have proportionally long limbs for their size, giving the bears the appearance of being quite lanky. This limb anatomy prompted some paleontologists to propose that the short-faced bears might have been very fast runners, swiftly covering short distances to hunt down prey. However, closer examination of the fossils has revealed that Arctodus most likely had these longer limbs as they allowed the bears to travel more efficiently at slower speeds, but across longer distances. The interesting anatomy of Arctodus has resulted in a few different lifestyles for these animals being suggested over the years. Initially, paleontologists thought that the short-faced bears must have been super predators of prehistoric North America, essentially being the bear equivalent of a big cat that would charge down prey and quickly dispatch their unfortunate victims. Another older idea was that the bears were specialized scavengers, using their long legs to travel over vast distances as they searched for carcasses, and their big body sizes could have been wielded to intimidate predators away from their kills so they could eat them instead. However, more recent investigations into the lifestyle of Arctodus have found that these enormous beasts were probably omnivores, like most living bears. Still, they would likely have preyed or scavenged on large herbivores such as bison, ground sloths, and mammoths when the opportunity arose. Indeed, there is potential fossil evidence of both woolly and Columbian mammoth carcasses having been fed on by the giant bears, as they display bite marks that match their teeth. Arctodus simus managed to survive until very recently, dying out just 12,800 years ago. So humans in North America coexisted with these awe-inspiring beasts for a period of time. A clash between these two formidable species would surely have been a terrifying and epic thing to witness. Amazingly, there's actually a very close relative of the magnificent short-faced bears that's made it until the modern day. The spectacled bear of South America belongs to the same subfamily as Arctodus, Tremarctinae, so it's technically the last surviving short-faced bear. There's loads more I could say about these fantastic prehistoric bears, and I haven't even mentioned the giant Central and South American Arctotherium, so let me know if you'd like me to do a full video on them. Next up, we're travelling down to South America to take a look at one of the various magnificent giant ground sloths that were living around this time. This is a species that you may not have heard of before, called Lestodon armatus. Lestodon lived from about 2.6 million years ago until at least 19,000 years ago, and likely more recently than this. Lestodon was the largest member of the mylodontid family of sloths, which are very close relatives of the living two-toed sloths. Sloth evolution is a whole thing that I really want to cover in more detail someday, as the two groups of living tree sloths are actually surprisingly distantly related to each other, meaning they convergently evolved with each other, with a whole bunch of extinct ground sloths being more closely related to each lineage. But anyway, I get way too excited about sloth evolution, so that's for another time. Lestodon could potentially grow up to a whopping 4.5 US tons, putting it at a similar scale to the famous Megatherium. It had some interesting skull anatomy with a wide muzzle that helped it to bulk feed on grasses with the aid of its square upper lip, and rather large, quite fearsome looking tusk-like teeth projecting from the upper and lower jaws. These teeth on the lower jaws seem to have been sexually dimorphic, with the ones in males being notably larger than in females. It's possible that they were therefore used as weapons in fights over mates. You can imagine these things could inflict quite a bit of damage. Lestodon was also quite adept at digging, with arm and claw anatomy well suited to this activity. However, it likely wasn't a full-time digger like some of its relatives were, with scientists hypothesizing that it would occasionally scratch at the ground perhaps to get at roots. But it probably wasn't excavating caves like some other South American sloths were. These structures are quite remarkable, with extensive scratch marks on the walls and ceilings that match sloth claws. Amazingly, the discovery of fossilized inner ear bones from Lestodon has enabled paleontologists to work out their hearing ranges, and it turns out they were capable of detecting very low frequency sounds. This could have been for a few purposes, perhaps for detecting specific approaching predators, or maybe it helped with digging. The most likely option is that they used low frequency calls to communicate with each other over vast distances, similar to elephants. There's also evidence that Lestodon was a social animal, with a fossil site in Argentina preserving 13 individuals of different ages that all died together. It seems that these sloths formed intergenerational herds and had complex social behaviours, though sadly 13 members of this particular herd were wiped out by some sudden catastrophic event, perhaps a flash flood. Combined with the evidence for sexual dimorphism, this group behaviour paints a picture of a complex social life for Lestodon. These beasts would have been fantastic animals to see in the flesh, and witnessing a herd of these enormous sloths would surely be a highlight of any prehistoric safari. Next, we're making a quick hop over to Asia 600,000 years ago. At this point in time, Asia was home to some pretty enormous tortoises. Specifically, there was a species of Megalochelys inhabiting the island of Timor in Indonesia. Megalochelys includes a few different species, and most of them lived much earlier on, but at least one species seems to have survived until more recent times on Timor. The biggest species, Megalochelys atlas, was absolutely enormous. In fact, it was the biggest tortoise to ever live as far as we know, with a mass of more than 900 kilograms, about 1 US ton, and a curved shell length of over 2 meters, about 6.5 feet. These large reptiles had some fascinating anatomy, including massive thickened fork structures at the front of their plastrons, the underside of the shell, which were probably used in combat. Some modern tortoises have similar structures to this, and they are indeed used to shove at each other while they retract their necks. Witnessing a couple of 1-ton prehistoric tortoises engaging in such activities would surely have been a sight to behold. Megalochelys had a skull that looked a lot like the modern Aldabra giant tortoise, and probably had a moderately long neck that would have enabled it to feed very efficiently on the surrounding vegetation. It also may have held its legs more directly underneath its body compared to some other tortoises. Coupled with the quite large openings for the limbs in its high domed shell, it seems Megalochelys may have been relatively speedy for a tortoise. Megalochelys atlas inhabited mainly continental areas of Asia, as well as some islands, but the Timor Megalochelys seems to have been a separate species, although it's not been named yet. Other smaller Megalochelys species were also living on the Indonesian island of Flores until about 900,000 years ago, where they would have coexisted with the so-called hobbits Homo floresiensis, as well as giant storks, giant rats, Komodo dragons, and other incredible animals. On Timor, Megalochelys was apparently still giant. It has been found in fossil beds containing the remains of the dwarf elephant relative Stegodon timorensis, plus another dwarf species of Stegodon has been found here too. In addition, the remains of another giant monitor lizard that was apparently unique to this island have been uncovered. So taking a trip back to Pleistocene Indonesia sounds like a great time, with islands that were home to giant tortoises and dwarf elephants, but definitely keep an eye out for those monitors. Up next on the itinerary for this prehistoric safari, we're travelling to Europe to see rhinos. Yes, you heard that right. 600,000 years ago, there were rhinoceroses roaming across the European countryside. Specifically, at this time, we'd be quite likely to see the prehistoric rhino species Stephanorhinus kirkbergensis, also known as Merck's rhinoceros or the forest rhino. This species range extended from Eastern Asia into Western Europe, and even to Britain. This was a pretty sizable animal, standing an estimated 182 centimeters tall at the shoulders, or about 6 feet, and probably weighing up to 3,000 kilograms, 6,600 pounds. It had 2 horns on its head, like the modern African and Sumatran species, and possessed quite a long skull attached to a very robust skeleton. Merck's rhino seems to have been a mixed feeder, meaning it ate a variety of different plant types that would have made it suited to the different kinds of environments found across its extensive range. Analysis of plant remains found stuck to the teeth of a few rhino fossils indicates that these animals were feeding on all kinds of different plants, from trees to grasses and nettles. These rhinos do seem to have shown some preference towards shrubland and woodland habitats though, as their fossils appear quite commonly in localities that preserve such ancient environments, at least based on examinations of sites in Germany, hence their name of forest rhino. Merck's rhinoceros is a very close relative of Stephanorhinus hemitochus, or the narrow-nosed rhinoceros, which coexisted with it in Europe and Asia for a significant portion of the Pleistocene epoch. This species was slightly smaller and had a slightly different head shape, with the skull being directed downwards more. Other characteristics also show this was a separate species from Merck's rhino, and it seems to have potentially preferred more open habitats. Its range was also not as extensive, although it did also occur in northern Africa, unlike Merck's rhino. The genus Stephanorhinus includes a few other extinct species too, and the closest living rhino to these animals is the critically endangered Sumatran rhinoceros. At a few sites that date to more recently than 600,000 years ago, some evidence has been found of ancient humans actually butchering and possibly hunting Merck's rhinos. Cut marks consistent with humans dismembering the rhinos' bodies have been found alongside stone tools, and it seems that in at least one of these sites in Europe, the humans were targeting mostly young and elderly rhinos. Taking down beasts of this size could not have been an easy task for these ancient people, and being able to see one of these magnificent European rhinos in life would absolutely be another highlight of any time-travelling safari. Moving next on our prehistoric safari to Africa, one animal that was likely just going extinct around 600,000 years ago was the immense Hippopotamus gorgops. This would have been a pretty terrifying animal to encounter in life, as it was much larger than living hippos and presumably would have been just as aggressive and dangerous. Hippopotamus gorgops might have been more specialized for an aquatic lifestyle compared to the modern Hippopotamus amphibius, since it had more elevated eye sockets that sat further up on its skull and also had nostrils that were closer to the top, enabling the animal to sit mostly submerged underwater while still breathing and seeing above the surface. As I mentioned, Hippopotamus gorgops was significantly larger than our modern hippos, potentially achieving body masses of more than 4,000 kilograms or nearly 9,000 pounds. For reference, the absolute largest hippos today can get to about 2,660 kilograms or almost 6,000 pounds. There are some really fascinating instances of interactions between Hippopotamus gorgops and ancient humans that lived much earlier than 600,000 years ago, about 1.8 to 1 million years ago in fact. At a few different sites across northern and eastern Africa, evidence has been found of ancient human species butchering these giant prehistoric hippos. At this much older point in time, the most likely culprits would be the human species Homo habilis or Homo erectus, going by the type of stone tool industry found associated with the hippo remains. It's not certain if these hippos had been actively hunted down or just scavenged, but their bones show signs of having been dismembered and fractured, clear indications that ancient humans had been cutting up their bodies for food. If they were really hunting them down, then these would have been some pretty brave little hominins. I would not have wanted to go anywhere near such a huge beast. Presumably, this human hunting of Hippopotamus gorgops would have continued until the species eventually went extinct, sometime during the middle part of the Pleistocene epoch. So, stepping back in time 600,000 years to Africa, you might have been able to witness giant prehistoric hippo hunts. That would surely have been a terrifying event for both species involved. And finally, we of course have to end our prehistoric safari by travelling into the horrifying world of prehistoric Australia. And 600,000 years ago was no disappointment, as this was a land stalked by marsupial lions, the ferocious Thylacoleo carnifex. I've done a whole video on this animal before, but it's just too cool to not mention again here. Thylacoleo was a marsupial, one of the pouched mammals, and was most likely a member of the Vombatiform suborder, so it was a relative of the living koala and wombats. Thylacoleo lived in a very different way to these herbivorous species, however, and was the apex predator of Australia at this time. This animal was about the size of an adult female lion, and they were specialised hypercarnivores with some absolutely deadly looking teeth. Towards the back of their jaws, they had premolars that had become enlarged and functioned like massive blades for shearing flesh, similar to the back teeth of cats and dogs, called the carnassials, but these had convergently evolved in Thylacoleo. The front of the marsupial's mouth bore huge and very sharp incisors that functioned like the canines of cats and dogs, whereas the actual canine teeth of Thylacoleo were absent in the lower jaw and highly reduced on the upper jaw. This formidable toothy weaponry was driven by an immense bite force, as Thylacoleo had the greatest calculated bite force relative to its body size of any mammal. Thylacoleo was likely a mostly terrestrial animal, but also seems to have been a capable climber. It's a scary thought that these beasts may have been leaping down from the trees to catch their prey, essentially like real-life drop bears. And it wasn't just their powerful bite you had to look out for either. Analysis of their forearm motion indicates that these marsupials had an extreme degree of maneuverability, meaning they likely grasped and manipulated their prey using their arms much more than other carnivorous mammals such as lions do. Plus, they had very large, retractable claws on a semi-opposable thumb, which would have done some significant damage to its unfortunate prey. Thylacoleo seems to have been an ambush predator suited for going after larger prey, such as giant kangaroos and the impressively huge herbivore Diprotodon, another Vombatiform related to Thylacoleo, wombats and koalas. Thylacoleo was a truly terrifying animal and has got to be one of the most formidable mammalian predators in history. Seeing one of these beasts hunt down its prey would absolutely be an unforgettable part of a prehistoric safari to Earth 600,000 years ago, as long as it was from a distance. Next up, what was the climate and geography of our planet like at this time?
600,000 years ago was an interesting time for our planet's climate. Although the last 2.5 million years of time counts as an ice age, since there are permanent ice sheets on the planet's surface all year round, there have been many cycles of glacial periods and interglacial periods throughout this range of time. Glacial periods are what most people think are ice ages. They are when the ice sheets and glaciers of the world expand to cover large areas of land that in our times are perfectly habitable. That cycle of glacial advance and retreat used to run on a roughly 41,000 year cycle. However, around 1 million years to 800,000 years ago, the mid-Pleistocene transition occurred, when that cycle extended to be on a roughly 100,000 year cycle. This obviously has made these subscriber special videos rather hard to write, as every 100,000 years the climate is essentially the same due to that mid-Pleistocene transition. Thanks guys. 600,000 years ago was therefore another interglacial period. It's kind of a given when we consider that we are currently in an interglacial period right now. In Europe, the span of time from around 800 to 500,000 years ago is known as the Cromerian. The Cromerian stage was just as complex as any other stage of the Pleistocene, encompassing an intricate ebb and flow of glacial and interglacial sequences as glaciers advanced and retreated from the poles. While the Cromerian was once known as the Cromerian Interglacial, and you'll almost always find artwork depicting everywhere as arid and warm, it is now known as the Cromerian Stage, as the time period was scattered with mild glacial sequences. Glacial, glacial, it's all the same to me. Around 600,000 years ago, the Earth experienced something called the Early Bruns Shift, which caused the climate to vary in extremes more. Interglacials became hotter and glacials cooler. This was a different event to the mid-Pleistocene transition, So it seems this really was a time of multiple massive changes in the climate. The shift's cause isn't fully known, but it appears to have been triggered partially by changes in carbon and monsoon cycles. Whatever the cause, the early Bruns shift extended and enhanced this glacial phase even further. 650,000 years ago, the Earth experienced the Don glaciation, one of the most extreme cold stages of the Pleistocene. Current estimates place it as about equal in scope to the glacial stages that occurred 20,000 and 450,000 years ago, the late Devonian and Anglian glaciation as they are called here in Britain. These two glacial cycles saw glaciers expand so far that human life and most animal life were impossible in much of northern Europe. The same likely happened with the Don glaciation. While global ice sheets achieved some of their furthest reaches, sea level temperatures seem to have been more stable and less cool. This may have been due to the fact that this was before the mid-Bruns shift, the more dramatic continuation of the early Bruns shift, which caused the glacial and interglacial cycles to become even more dramatic. So the sea level at the time was probably quite low, but not as low as would have been seen during the end Devonian glaciation 20,000 years ago, where much of Doggerland and the Bering Land Bridge was exposed. Of course, the Don glaciation eventually ended, and by 620,000 years ago, the Earth experienced a mild interglacial. By 600,000 years ago exactly, temperatures seem to have dropped slightly, but this short dip lasted only a relatively short period of time. By 570,000 years ago, temperatures had risen to even higher than they were before, and an interglacial similar to today's temperatures, or the last interglacial, called the Ipswichian here in Britain, occurred. Sea levels at this time would have been slightly lower than today, which would have allowed for more animal and, importantly, hominin migration around the world, particularly in Europe and Asia. As always, temperatures fluctuated further, and by 550,000 years ago, a mild glacial period occurred. This was nowhere near as dramatic as the Don glaciation, but temperatures were still notably cooler, and glaciers had advanced further. So that's a quick overview of the climate changes occurring around 600,000 years ago. But what were the human species up to at the time? Let's go over to Doug to find out. I don't know why I did that. It was an intrusive thought that occurred to me.
When we started doing these specials, we started off by looking at what the world was like 10,000 years ago. Even though 10,000 years ago was slightly outside my general area of historical knowledge, it made sense for me to cover the human stuff because that's what I knew the most about. Well, at 600,000 years ago, my background knowledge was very minimal indeed, so Quinn and Amelia have done a lot of the research notes for this section. 600,000 years ago is a rather long time, and the human species as we know it, that is, Homo sapiens, had a very long time to go before their beginning. Our most famous relatives, Homo neanderthalensis, or Neanderthals, had also yet to appear. This time period is actually a bit of a weird time for humans, or if we're being scientific about it, a weird time for paleoanthropology. 600,000 years ago lands right within what's known as the muddle in the middle. We're a good way into the Middle Pleistocene at the moment, and after this point in the Middle Pleistocene, as we've seen in our other specials, we see the much more recognisable names of the latest human species, like the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and, eventually, Homo sapiens. If we go before the Middle Pleistocene, we have the evidence that shows Homo erectus just starting to spread out across Africa, Europe and Asia. But during the time span we're looking at, we only have evidence of a few isolated populations of humans that cause confusion with their evolution, because they all look rather different from each other. Now, usually what I like to do in these videos is provide a broad overview of all the different human species around the planet at the time, the macro. But greater and more learned minds than my own have tried to solve this riddle, and I don't think I'm going to be able to just give you a cure for this problem by myself. So, we're going to take a step back here. 600,000 years ago, we know that human species were more diverse than they ever had been before, and these species had spread out further than they ever had done before. We know there were successful human populations in Africa, like the owner of the Bodo cranium that I'll get onto in a minute. We know that in Asia, a massive amount of diversity was just beginning, which we can see from the Nanjing hominins and fossils from later times. In Britain and Western Europe, a new culture was being developed by yet more mystery humans that were expanding into areas humans had never gone to before. But there's just so much we don't know. Was the human genus composed of a large number of different species that looked different, lived in different places but had similar cultures? Or is it just a couple of species that lived in very isolated populations that became very diverse because of this isolation? Well, that's the little question I mentioned earlier that I'm not going to solve. So we'll be leaving that to the paleoanthropologists. What I will do, however, is take a step back from the macro and start to get a little bit more micro with our analysis. Let's take a look at more specific pieces of evidence so we may, at least, be able to get an idea of what life might have been like on a more human scale 600,000 years ago. Well, first off, I'm going to cover that Bodo cranium I mentioned earlier. The Bodo cranium is a collection of cranial pieces, that is, pieces from a skull, discovered in Ethiopia as an anthropological and archaeological site called Bodo in the Awash River Valley. The lower portion of the skull, with additional pieces of cranium, was discovered in October of 1976, with the upper portion of the face being discovered 2 weeks later, just 11 metres away from the rest of it. 5 years later, in 1981, a partial parietal bone was discovered, the parietal bone being the one that makes up the top and sides of the skull. These pieces are thought to belong to a second individual, and are the only other human remains found in the area. Both of these individuals are around 600,000 years old. Initially, it was thought that the Bodo cranium belonged to some archaic individual of Homo sapiens, which would have been a massive development in the history of our species, pushing the earliest known Homo sapiens remains from 300,000 years ago to 600,000 years ago. So it would double the known period of existence for our own species. The idea that the skull could belong to Homo sapiens is mostly based off of its large brain volume, which does lie within the range of modern humans. In addition, it also has a relatively flat face, another prominent feature of Homo sapiens. Nowadays though, this is not widely accepted at all, and there are instead some other ideas as to what the Bodo cranium may have belonged to. Homo rhodesiensis is a human species that we don't really know much about, thought to be a sort of African variant of Homo heidelbergensis, similar to how Homo ergaster is thought to be the African variant of Homo erectus. This idea was brought forward because of the very unusual mix of primitive and more modern characteristics of the skull. We mentioned the large brain volume and flat face, but this skull also has a heavy brow ridge and a long, low brain case that is usually seen in older human species. This too is not a well-regarded idea, however, partly because the name Homo rhodesiensis is barely, if ever, used in today's paleoanthropology. Specimens that are thought to belong to this species can vary quite wildly from one another. Another, more uncomfortable reason for wanting to distance ourselves from Homo rhodesiensis as a species name is because it honours Cecil Rhodes, a racial supremacist who disenfranchised the black population of southern Africa. So in 2021, it was suggested that a new species should be named, and that the Bodo cranium should serve as the holotype for Homo bodoensis, a new species that could replace the poorly named and defined Homo rhodesiensis and help better designate human species in the Middle Pleistocene from the southern hemisphere. The paper naming the species assigned all European Homo heidelbergensis fossils as early Neanderthals. It also takes all the Middle Pleistocene African fossils, as well as some specimens from the Levant and Balkans, which clearly aren't Neanderthals, and defines them as Homo bodoensis, effectively removing the existence of both Homo rhodesiensis and Homo heidelbergensis, and redefining some late Homo erectus as well. The reclassifications in this 2021 paper haven't really seen much use since then. While they do create a much needed new name, other paleoanthropologists have argued against the new classification, explaining that it doesn't really clarify anything and does, unfortunately, violate nomenclature rules. It's worth noting that the Bodo cranium actually bears a rather striking resemblance to the Kabwe skull, another archaic human from Africa that's around half the age, dating to about 300,000 years ago. They both have heavy brow ridges, large brain volumes that are within the range of modern humans, and upon first inspection, seem to represent a transition from archaic humans like Homo erectus to Homo sapiens. The Kabwe skull has features that are much more archaic than Homo sapiens though, suggesting that while the Kabwe skull is anatomically very close to modern humans, it represents its own late offshoot. It could therefore be that the Bodo cranium and Kabwe skulls both represent their own offshoots from Homo erectus that evolved in Africa alongside Homo sapiens. They also share some similarities with the Cima de los Huesos hominins from Spain that we covered in our 500k special. Another clue to humanity that we have from this time period is a set of remains known as the Nanjing Man. In 1993, large fragments from a male and a female skull along with a molar tooth were discovered in Hulu Cave in China. The skulls are dated to between 580 and 620,000 years old, with the tooth only being 400,000 years old. Similarly to the Bodo cranium, these skulls have not been definitely assigned to a human species, and have only been loosely identified as probably belonging to Homo erectus or something similar. They do share similarities with other Asian hominin skulls that also have unclear identities, like the Harbin cranium, Hue Longdong skull, and Dali Man. Many of these remains are only recently being researched, so scientists have been careful not to poorly define an array of specimens and massively complicate the time period. These specimens are particularly notable for their age. There are very few Asian hominin specimens that are 600,000 years old or older. In addition to this, their smaller brain capacity and general robustness could potentially point to something bigger altogether. They could be a potential origin point for the wide array of human species across Asia. The samples of Asian hominin fossils are a rapidly expanding group of specimens, and it's only in the last 2 decades that researchers have properly realised the true scope of Pleistocene hominin diversity in this continent. We've had access to a complicated and diverse set of specimens in Europe that has allowed us to understand the extremely complicated and fascinating history of human evolution in Europe, so it's not hard to imagine a similar diversity, or perhaps even a bigger one, on the larger continent of Asia, creating an intricate system of evolution, extinction, and interbreeding. For my final case study, let's head home. Our home, at least. For a long time, there was only one site in Britain that held the banner of containing the earliest tools in the UK. This was the Bytham Riverbed, a massive ancient river that flowed through central England and modern-day Norfolk before coming out of the North Sea. It was destroyed by the advancing glaciers during the Anglian glaciation, the most extreme glacial period in Britain, with glaciers reaching all the way to the bottom of Wales and the south of England. The Anglian glaciation occurred 450,000 years ago, so we know that artefacts found along what used to be the Bytham River date to before this point. 2 different cultures of hand axes have been found at several sites along the river. The first are impressively constructed Acheulean hand axes that hold nearly identical similarities to the culture seen at Boxgrove on the south coast of England, a site we covered in our previous special. These have been dated to, spoilers, 500,000 years ago. Some hand axes found at the site, however, seem more crude and worn than the other artefacts, signalling a different culture is present here, an older culture of humans altogether that produced these tools around 600,000 years ago. This tool architecture does seem similar to the Acheulean culture, a culture of toolmaking that has been seen across a few different species of humans, from Homo heidelbergensis to Neanderthals. This older, so-called Proto-Acheulean culture used to be classified as a separate culture altogether, either called Chelian or Abervillian, but has now been subsumed into the Acheulean. Recently, it has been realised that the earliest tools found on the Bytham River are nearly identical to the earliest tools found at a cave on the south coast of England called Kent's Cavern. The tools have been found in sediment that has been dated to around 350 to 500,000 years ago, but because this is the very earliest sediment to flow into the caves, it's clear that they were left by an extinct species of human sometime before the caves were actually accessible, and the sediment was brought into the cave around 500,000 years ago. Given their similarities to the tools found on the Bytham River, it is thought that these Kent's Cavern tools are also about 600,000 years old. While both sets of findings have clearly been reworked by ancient river flows, there is a third site in Britain that contains artefacts that don't seem to have been reworked at all after they were deposited. A quarrying site in Kent has been found to contain a very large number of early Acheulean artefacts. Lots of them have been dated to around 550,000 years ago, but some more crudely made artefacts, a massive 330 of them, have been given a minimum age of 600,000 years old. The culture does seem to be very similar to those found at our other 2 locations. So, it seems that some hominin species were permanently living in Britain just over 600,000 years ago. They could have lived in small, spread out populations, but what these extinct humans actually were is not known. At the moment, they're loosely defined as Homo heidelbergensis, as these are the only known human species in Europe at this time. But perhaps in the future, if we can find some actual human remains from this time, we may be able to uncover the true identity of this mysterious human species who left their tools for us to find. Well, that's it from me, and that also marks the end of the video as well. It's been an honour to be able to do these milestone videos as often as we do, and we look forward to hopefully getting started on the 700,000 special soon as well. It's been a pretty crazy couple of months for the channel, but we've got so many more exciting things in store for you this and next year. Thank you to everyone who supported this channel in whatever way you have done over the years, and thank you for helping us reach the rather mind-boggling subscriber count of 600,000. Here's to the next one. If you happen to be watching this video and you're not subscribed, well, I hope you've enjoyed it enough to want to hear more about our planet and its fascinating history. So do subscribe so you don't miss our future content. Oh.
Thank you all so much again for your continued support. It really is amazing that we get to continue making these videos and that so many people still enjoy watching. Just before we end the video, I want to mention our collaboration with Plush Foundry to bring you an adorable plushy version of everyone's favourite problem child, Spinosaurus. This scientifically accurate, as far as we know, plushie is so cute, featuring the M-shaped sail, the expanded newt-like tail, and an adorable little crest on its head. And we've named him Swimbo. If you would like your very own Swimbo, then please head to the link in the description to pre-order him. We need 150 pre-orders to get him funded, and this is a limited edition Spinosaurus that won't be made again, so this is your only chance to get one. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching and subscribing. If you would like to find out more about our world, its history, and the wonderful life that surrounds us all, please feel free to subscribe to the channel if you think we deserve it, and if you would like to see more from us.